It's 4th of Nissan 5786 Sunday, March 22nd. I can't believe it's so difficult to get into some old accounts. It's ridiculous. There needs to be a better way to do it. Oh, because of security. Well, like nobody else is trying to get in his effing account. Are you done? No. No one really knows for sure. Eleve Elu Divrei Elohim Chaim, but the system is where we live now. How many days have you been doing this, bitch? It's the worst. 86. Like getting 86 out of a motherfucker. You ever been 86 out of a place? I've been 86 out of entire unincorporated areas. Really? Oh, for sure, dog. For sure. For sure. Like the whole, like on a map. I'm not allowed on areas of maps. Really? Oh, it's just garbage. Like there's a section of a map that I'm not allowed in. If I go there, bad shit happens. Really? Where is it? I don't know. Maybe a whole fucking country at this point. All right, kids. $37.60, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. Chava. I used it like 15 times in a conversation with her. Really? Yeah. Why not?
Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel into the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism and hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Alright, folks. Well, welcome back to this sort of traveling, let's call it a service. five ring circus. I don't know, five ring circus. That's pretty cool. Let's get back into this, and let's start by just again, as we try to do every time, let's just recap a little bit so we're all on the same page. And that page, of course, here on the left is a picture from Sefer Razi Hamala, one of the most famous books of Jewish magic ever written. You're seeing two different kamayot. These are amulets for various kinds of things written in angelic language. So if you want to know what the language of the angels looks like, those are two examples of angelic language being written out there. Now, what they say, I have no idea. You have to ask the angels. Write Michael at olamhaba.gov, and maybe he'll write you back. Let's write you back. What we learned, right, Michael at olamhaba.gov, and maybe he'll write you back. Let's write you back. What we learned last time about Jewish magic, and we did sort of a big romp through Jewish magic, is that Judaism and magic have had a very complicated, very long relationship. I say very long relationship because, as I pointed out last time, the earliest document we have of the Torah is a magical amulet recovered from Jerusalem and the Kittib Edom tombs there, and it's written on silver. You can see it in the Israel Museum. So the very first documents we have of the Bible are magical amulets, probably. So if you're going to say that Jews don't do magic, well, they must not do Torah too. So it's a non-starter. So they've had this very complicated, very tortured history of magic. But on the one hand, it's very clear that the Bible and the people that wrote the Hebrew Bible have a very uncomfortable relationship with magical practices for lots of reasons. Theological reasons, obviously, included here, right? The idea that you can affect supernatural causation. If you can affect supernatural causation, then who needs a God? It kind of makes God redundant, right? God becomes like a thing that you really don't need. If you can, like, make it rain, you can make yourself fall in love with people, or make them fall in love with people, or make pennies from heaven. Who needs a God when they can win the lottery on their own magic? And at the same time, right, we see that Jewish magic has persisted all through the century. We see it again all the way back to Kittib Edom and all the way down through now. And as I pointed out, right, when I say all the way down through now, my bottom point really obtains here. In the Haredi community, in the community of ultra-Orthodox Jews, we see magical manuals still being published to this day. And also, of course, in the liberal Jewish world, there's an entire world of practicing Jewish witches and other folks who identify as Kohenites, who are also very interested in things like astrology and magical practices. And so we see that the Jewish magic has really thrived down through the ages, and unsurprisingly, it's mirrored local magical traditions. So we see that Jewish magic often looks a lot like the magic of the area that they're living in. So we see the same kinds of magic in the Greco-Egyptian period. We see Jewish magic being practiced in the Babylonian context with those cool incantation bowls. And then as we move through the Roman period and the European period, we're going to see that Jewish magic will often borrow from the local culture, but also influence those cultures as well. And that will be especially true in the European context, where Jewish magic has had a disproportionate impact on the development of European magic. That's why here it's the magical squares. Most books of magic, European non-Jewish books of magic, there's some Hebrew there, right? Well, it's not because they like Jews. They were perfectly happy to see Jews sent to whatever dreadful fate they were sent to. But they did it because the Jews had secret powers, magical powers, and they were perfectly happy to use them. As we saw, Jewish magic ran the gamut, right? It ran the gamut from curses. Everybody insulting, right? Yeah, cursing people's like your thing, right? Divination, who doesn't want to have the future? Love magic, because who wants to go to sleep alone? But, again, we should be careful, right? Love magic, consent is a value we have around here. And, of course, love magic isn't about consent. We have grimoires, which are medieval Jewish spell books that contain a wide range of Jewish magical experiments. In fact, in medieval times, Al, you'll appreciate this, that the word experiment actually derives itself from the medieval Latin word for experimenta, which were magical spells. So the word experiment actually has its origin in the technical word for magical operation. And the word experiment actually comes from that. So if you look at medieval magical manuals, they'll say an experiment for invisibility. And what's interesting, right, those invisibility spells would be tinkered with to try to make them work better or work at all. And so when modern science, the so-called new science, came along, they just adopted that language. And so it's interesting to see that, again, the balance between the language between magic and science early on is pretty vague sometimes. So we also use amulets, right? Amulets are devices used to call various kinds of either to receive positive energy, perhaps with a star, stellar influence, or repulse bad energy in the form of things like demons, shamans. So we use amulets. Astrological magic is also very popular. Sefer Rashi Hamala, what you're looking at now on the screen, was a big part of angel magic, astrological magic. We have demon capturing bowls. We have the creation of living beings. We talk a lot about that tonight as we get into Sefer Yetzirah. The golem is probably the Jewish monster par excellence. I imagine most folks here have heard of the golem. Of course, that myth comes from the Sefer Yetzirah, which we'll talk about this evening at length. Of course, we also have angel summoning and the whole thing. So Jewish magic really ran the gamut. So again, what I really want to drive home about the process of Jewish magic is what I said last time, is that people who want to tell you that magic isn't Jewish, there's no such thing as Jewish magic, well, they got some archaeology to talk to. Right? That's my basic argument. You can say that this is not a thing and that's not a thing. You can say it's not acceptable in your community, you're fine. But to tell me that Jews didn't do it for 3,000 years, you're just badly informed. I don't know what else to tell you. The scientific, archaeological, paleographic data tells me that you're wrong. And if you want to just sort of put your fingers in the air and go la 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 la, you can do this. Well, have fun being wrong, because it's very good to choose to do. So, no, again, whether your community accepts it, whether they'll go to Oak Park over there, and whether they are okay with it, or Borough Park, or go to Grand Heights and see if they practice magic, I don't know. But probably, yeah, again, they're not down the street. He's up 12 in the middle of the night doing some weird stuff. He might be up to some magic, right? And he wouldn't be that weird. And if you think about this from a historical perspective, with the fact that there are magicians, sorcerers operating in Jewish communities all over the world in history, any community that doesn't have one is probably a weirdo community. That's probably the one that doesn't have one, right? The much more likely outcome is that. So Jewish magic has been here, it will be here, it's not going to go away. And by the way, this is true of magic in general. Magic is more popular now than ever before. Right? So for better or worse, it is. So tonight, we're going to do it, folks. We're going to get into the very first vestiges, the very first layer stratum of the Kabbalah. So we're going to do it. We're talking about this distinction between Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. We're not going to hit that. We're going to begin to get into the world of Kabbalah. But to do that, we have to introduce things a little bit from a philosophical angle. And that's because while people often think of Kabbalah as a kind of mysticism, and people think of mysticism as somehow opposed to science or opposed to philosophy, those kinds of oppositions just did not exist in the late classical world, and they certainly didn't exist in the Middle Ages. So we have to loosen up our categories a little bit here, right? Because we often think of these things existing in opposites, right? Science doesn't like mysticism, mysticism doesn't like philosophy and science can't really get along. And so if they're all fighting, and this is the way people do this, is all right? It's not theirs. Their world is a much different world than ours. And the first thing we have to do is kind of, take your modernity hat off and put a different hat on, whatever that hat is, big or whatever. And so we have to understand that in the late classical world, the relationship between philosophy, mysticism, magic, religion was very common and very mixed together. Right? So drawing a line between one of these and the other of these is just really not possible. And so what we have to understand is that Judaism has always had a very weird relationship with the outside world. Always very weird relationship, right? Because on the one hand, Jews want to maintain their cultural, religious distinctiveness. And on the other hand, well, the outside world's kind of cool. They got Greek science, and they got like TV, and they got Xbox, and all this stuff, right? So there's all kinds of things about the outside world that you want to admit is cool, and yet at the same time, we don't want to use the bad A word. You know what the bad A word is? assimilate. Assimilate, right? This is the bad A word, right? This idea that Jews do not want to assimilate, but they always have to some degree. And even when they don't, that non-assimilation is actually a response to assimilation, right? You're never outside that line. And so dealing with the relationship between ancient late classical Jews and Greek science. Because the Greeks had a lot of stuff you don't focus. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, whether they were right or wrong, I don't think they were. The Greek model of the world was a far better model of the world. It explained, at least at some level, why the planets did what they did. Right? Greek science, Greek math, right? When you see it, I mean, I don't know if folks here have ever done a geometry class, right? But when you prove to yourself that Pythagorean theorem is true, it's magical. It's magical. When you see proof, mathematical proof of something, you're like, damn, that's really true. That's for real true. Not like I made it up, like I had a fever dream about it being true, whatever. That's true. And it can't be otherwise. The Greeks pioneered a lot of this stuff. Now, it's not to say the Greeks invented everything, right? The Pythagorean theorem has been known by the Babylonians in the form of what are called Pythagorean triplets well before Pythagoras, right? Pythagoras is heavily on the Egyptians for a lot of his mathematical knowledge, as you might imagine. Teaches you a thing or two about triangles. So, again, the Greeks had things going on, right? And the Greeks were the big pioneers of what we might now recognize as something like empirical science or theoretical science. Now, what's really important about this is, right, Jews have always had a sort of touch-pull relationship with Greek science. But what increasingly begins to happen is that Jewish philosophy begins to be deeply influenced by two distinct forms of Greek philosophy. Now, these two forms of Greek philosophy, we have names for them now, right? We call them Neo-Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism. Now, more with Neoplatonism next time when we get into Kabbalah proper. But tonight, what I really want to focus on is a school of Greek philosophy that we now call Neo-Pythagoreanism. Now, you can imagine how many Greeks called their philosophy Neo-Pythagoreanism. The answer is exactly zero. No Greeks called their school that. Right? Everyone just thought they were being philosophers. But there are two things that are really important about what we now call Neo-Pythagoreanism. Right? And don't be put off by the name. It's one of these $4 words that make philosophers sound smart. Basically, what we're talking about here is two things. One thing we're talking about here is the influence of Pythagorean philosophy. And Pythagorean philosophy is the same philosophy that many string theorists probably believe in today, and that is the world is fundamentally mathematical. Right? Not describable in terms of math, but math. The world is mathematical, right? And so that's the main thing, right? That the structure of reality, the fundamental structure of reality is mathematical in nature. Again, this idea probably is more popular now in some forms of contemporary physics than it ever has been. The second thing that's worth noting about this is that for the Neo-Pythagoreans, the union with God was possible. One could be like God, right? God, singular God, right? Because the Pythagoreans are all about like everything going back to one, right? So they really thought fundamental things were basically one. And so the idea was you could be like that too. You could unite your consciousness, you could unite your being, you could unite your nous with the divine. And as you can imagine, those two ideas are going to be part and parcel of a great deal of what becomes mysticism in the ancient world and, of course, in the modern world as well. By the way, the image you're seeing on the screen here is an image from a Pythagorean or Neo-Pythagorean basilica that was actually discovered in the 18th century in Rome. It's recently been reopened. I've always wanted to go there. It's perfectly preserved. This is where Neo-Pythagoreans hung out in Rome. It's basically completely preserved. It was only discovered on accident. And so it's really neat to go into these places where these guys were like hanging out, talking about numbers and stuff. And it's actually preserved in Rome. I think they allow a very small amount of people to go in there. So next time I go to Rome, I'm going to try to be one of those very small people. So let's combine that, right? Let's think of this idea with some ideas from Judaism. Now, Judaism, as you probably know from the book of Genesis in the Bible, Bereshit, that the way that God makes the world in Jewish lore, in Jewish mythology, and Israelite mythology, that God speaks the world into being. That the existence is a speech act, right? God says, Yehor, let there be light, and by Yehor, there was light. The very act of speech causes being to come into existence. And thus, right, if God speaks Hebrew, which of course Israelites thought, Jews think that God does, that's the language of God. In fact, that's what we call Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, right? Lashon Kodesh, that it is holy language. The very reality of Hebrew is that Hebrew itself has magical power. It's the case that the language itself is special. It's metaphysically powerful. It's quasi-divine. Because if God speaks it, then it can't be just a bunch of random sounds, right? We make random sounds, dog, right, or whatever, right? We think of sounds as being random, but God's speech isn't random. God's speech is the opposite of random. It's ordering. Because in the ancient Israelite imagination, remember back from the first talk, that what goes on in the ancient Israelite mind worldview is that God is ordering the world out of chaos. For the ancient Israelites, it's chaos versus order. So what does God's speech do? It orders the universe. And this is unsurprising, right? Because grammar, if you've ever studied some grammar, been tortured by some grammar, you know the thing that's torturous about grammar is orderly. And that's what's hard about it. It's about learning the patterns, learning when there's exceptions to patterns, and why there are exceptions to patterns. It's orderly. And so language as an act of order is how God created the world. There was nothing, tohu bohu, chaos, and then God spoke, and it ordered it. So Hebrew has this kind of power. We see this very early on in Israelite, you might call it linguistics or ontology or metaphysical language. There are two ways in which this plays itself out. The first, of course, is that language is magical. This is unsurprising, right? If you imagine a sorcerer, one thing every child knows about what sorcerers say, right, is abracadabra. Well, you might think that's just nonsense gibberish, but it's not. It's Aramaic. Abracadabra literally means in Aramaic something like, I create as I speak. Now, think about that for a minute, right? Abracadabra, I create as I speak. Well, if a magician is uttering that, who are they imitating? God. Because God creates speech. So, on the one hand, we have language is magical. You can do magical language. We've already seen that with Hebrew being used in all these magical practices. But if you can speak that magical language, it's not just that you can do magical powers. You have magical powers. You are also imitatio Dei, imitating God. You're being as if a God, right? Because God can do it through language. Well, if God speaks that language and you speak that language, you are kind of being quasi-divine. And so, insofar as one can speak that language, you conjure things into being, you can imitate God, but also you become unified with God. Because in the same way that God creates his speech, you create his speech, you are imitating and being like God. This is the theological equivalent of fake it till you make it. Right, folks? This is you becoming united with God by acting like God. And by acting like God, one becomes unified with God. So you can see how this circuit is being closed, right? And how the role of Hebrew in Israelite theology and the role of Hebrew in the action of doing sort of mystical stuff, right, allow one to engage in this mystically powerful language. The image here to the left that you're seeing is from Abraham Abulafi, founder of the Prophetic Kabbalah, in a couple of weeks. These are meditation wheels by which one can, in fact, change one's consciousness by, and by changing one's consciousness, I mean, elevate one's consciousness to be unified with God via prophecy by meditating on specific words in the Hebrew alphabet. This is from manuscript of Abraham Abulafi, not written by him, but of one of his texts. We'll get to him in a couple of years. The first time we see this idea of imitating God by using language to create things is in the Babylonian Talmud. And this gets back to Al's point, right, where Al commented that on the one hand we have the rabbis and everyone else. Well, here's where I want to disrupt that. Because in the Babylonian Talmud, we have the rabbis doing the exact same, the thing that you said they did do, right? You wanted to draw a line, and here's what I'm saying, the line can't be drawn. So we have in the Babylonian Talmud in two different stories, which are probably mirroring each other, being told by two different rabbis, in Tractate Sanhedrin, where we have both Abiah and Rabbah, two very prominent rabbis, discussing death penalty cases, right? So the Tractate Sanhedrin, as you may know from Babylonian Talmud, is all about death penalty cases. And one of the things that is a death penalty case is sorcery. You're not allowed to practice sorcery. And so what is constitutive of sorcery, right? So they said there's all kinds of things that are constitutive of sorcery, right? But creating illusions isn't. You're allowed to create illusions. This is the rabbinical idea that you can do stage magic. In fact, you should, I think in modern Hebrew, actually indicate stage magic. Right? What is allowed? This is positively mind-boggling. Alright? Such was formed by Rabbi Sina and Rabbi Shaya, spent every Shabbat in studying Hilchot Yetzirah. We'll talk about what this is in just a minute. By means of which they created a third grown calf. So they studied Hilchot Yetzirah, right? This literally means the doing of the Yetzirah, right? So if you want to have a book about the law, but Hilchot Shabbat is how to practice Shabbat. It's the laws of Shabbat. Hilchot Yetzirah is the laws of formation. How do you make something? Well, what did they do? They studied it, and on the eve of on Erev Shabbos, on the Shabbat Eve, they created a third grown calf, and they named it for Shabbat. They made the calf. They made one. Rabbah says, this is even more dramatic. Rabbah says that if the righteous desired it, they could create a world. Now, this translation is hiding something. This is the translation from Sefaria, but the actual translation in the Aramaic says they can create a world. Just like God. They can create full lines. Now, that is positively mind-blowing. That if you are righteous, you can create a world. Right? But you have inequity, so you can't. Now, Rabbah created a man, right, and sent him to Rabbi Zerah. And Rabbi Zerah said to him, right, spoke to him and said, he received no answer, right? He was mute. And thereupon he said, you're a creature of the magicians, actually in Hebrew, Aramaic rather, he said, you're one of the company, right? Like, you're one of those guys, right? It's in Hebrew and Aramaic. It says, go back to the dust, right? And Rabbi Sina and Rabbi Shah said, also spent studying Sefer Yetzirah, by means of which they create the third row path. So in the Babylonian Talmud, again, the central part of rabbinical Judaism, there is no more important book of Judaism than the Babylonian Talmud. We have rabbis making calves. So the distinction between what's magic and what's orthodox at this point has to be breaking down. It has to be fully breaking down. Because I don't know about you, if I made a person rise from dust and then sent them to you, you're going to be like, well, if it ain't magic, it'll do until magic gets here. Damn. Like, again, if making people ain't magic, I don't know what it is. So what we have in Babylonian Talmud is the idea that somehow they're studying some book, some text, and creating people. Now again, the person's mute. So there's no doubt about the fact that it's not a perfect person. They're mute, right? Which would have been thought of as a disability in the ancient world. Again, ancient ableism aside. What we have here is an image of creation by some kind of study. Further at ViralRabbi 55's base, we have the idea that Bezalel was chosen by God to be the architect of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Why? Because Bezalel, I have the story not because my name is Bezalel, but it's a great story, but because Bezalel knew how to join the letters by which heaven and earth were created. So again, listen to that in the Babylonian Talmud at ViralRabbi 55 base. that the Salah was chosen because he understood how to combine the letters by which heaven and earth were
No
created.
way.
So already by the Talmud, we have the idea that the heavens and the earth were created, the cosmos were created by the combination of letters. And here again, in Tractate Sanhedrin 67-65 base, we have the idea that you create if you are righteous. If you are righteous. I'm not that righteous, thank God. Now, what's this text? Right? What's this text? Sefer Yetzirah is, without a doubt, the most enigmatic and important book of Jewish mysticism prior to Kabbalah. There is no more important book prior to the rise of Kabbalah in terms of Jewish mysticism than Sefer Yetzirah. I'll go on to say also later, Sefer Yetzirah is canonical. It's scripture now. In the Orthodox world, you can make arguments based on it. It is a kind of Jewish scripture. We're not like the Christians. The Christian canon is basically closed. The Muslim canon is definitely closed, right? The Jewish canon kind of is open. Stuff gets in, right? And from community to community, right? Things get in. And Sefer Yetzirah has certainly got in. I would consider it to be part of the Jewish canon, right along with the Bible and with the Babylonian Talmud and the Sefer Yetzirah, etc. What is it? What is the Sefer Yetzirah? It is a text produced sometime between 500 and 1,000 of the Common Era. It's very brief. It's only about 2,000 words long, and it's a speculative text describing the method by which God created the cosmos, or the olam. I'm going to use the word olam because I prefer to use the cosmos. I think has it has connotations that are a little bit maybe too modern. And when I say olam would include all of the physical world we now know of, described by the standard model of particle physics with 25 particles, 4 forces. But the olam is a much bigger angle about what that would include ancient beings and all kinds of things. So anyway, the Sefer Yetzirah describes very, very brief words, right? They're only about 2,000 words on average recension. We can talk about recensions later. There are 3 or 4 different recensions of the Sefer Yetzirah that have come down to us, and there's a debate about how they came down to us. But what we have is a book describing how the world was created, attributed to none less than the patriarch Abraham. Why Abraham? Because there is a line in Genesis where it said Abraham made souls, right? Abraham created souls. And the idea is that because Abraham created souls, the only way he could have done that is he has access to Sefer Yetzirah, and therefore that's proof for the traditional community at least that because Abraham could create souls, that he was also in command of the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, when was this book written down? The shorter answer is we have no idea. We just don't know. Sometime before 1000 of the Common Era, right? Now, the debate goes that sometime between the 2nd century and the 11th century, 800 years or something. We don't know. It's very difficult to figure out when this book was written down. I tend to agree with Zaki Weiss, who I'll have his name in his book in the recommended reading at the end of the lecture tonight. I tend to agree with Zaki Weiss, who was produced in the 7th century, maybe the 8th century. But it doesn't really matter for this class. We're not going to get into the weeds about when it was written down. However, you may be interested in when it was published here on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see the first edition of Sefer Yetzirah published in Mantua in 1562. I could be wrong about that, but I think it was 1562 that was published in Mantua. But we have a first edition copy here. One of these copies, by the way, sells for about $60,000. So if you have $60,000 lying around, you want to buy me a gift, feel free to pick me up a copy of the Mantua edition of the Sefer Yetzirah. So, what is the Sefer Yetzirah? As I said, right, it's a book describing how God made the world. Now, what's also important about the Sefer Yetzirah is it is the first time we hear the word separate. Now, this is a word that, for folks familiar with Kabbalah, this is a word you probably have heard before, right? Sephirot is one of these words that is a mainstay in the world of Kabbalah. Now, there are 2 things that are important about this word, Sephirot. The first thing that's important about this word is that no one knows what it means, right? the root of the word, the shortish of the word is SSR, which in typical language Hebrew means to count, right? It just means to count. Now, if you want to make a verb, if you want to make a noun out of that, right? Typically the noun would be mispar. And mispar actually does mean number. That is the Hebrew word for number. Mispar is parim, right? It's the word for number. Well, the writer of this text doesn't go that route. They invent a new word that we've never seen before. And that new word they invent is separate. Now, what they do is they take the word sphera and they add an oat to it from their plural ending, so we know it's in plural. What makes this word even more weird is that it's always accompanied in the Sefer Yetzirah with the term belima, the adjective belima. Now, the word belima only occurs once in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's a Lampat Flagemanon, which means it only occurs once. And it's weird. Well, we know that beli, right, means without, and ma means one. And so it seems to mean without one. Now, what we have is a word made up, separate, which kind of means number, and without one. So literally we can translate it as number without one. Now, if you put that into the actual text, it makes no sense. Whatever the author is trying to do here, whatever they're trying to describe, a literal reading of it doesn't make sense. So, what are the Sephirot Belima? What do we mean by the Sephirot the first time they appear in all of Jewish literature and all the history of Jewish mysticism? Well, the one thing that we know from Sefer Yetzirah is they are not divine emanations. Now, I know that folks are familiar with some Kabbalah, right? You've seen the Tree of Life, right? With the dots, right? And God goes, get there, right? 10 things. We'll get to that later, right? And that's the Tree of Life, those are the Sphirot. Well, in the Sefer Yetzirah, it's not that. Whatever it is. It's not that. They are not divine emanations. We'll get there tonight. In a minute. They're not that. What are they? No one knows. No one knows. Go and guess. I say guess, right? But I really didn't mean guess. Go and guess that this is being influenced by Neo-Pythagoreanism. Right? Neo-Pythagoreanism. Remember, Neo-Pythagoreanism is all about this number stuff, right? Remember, it's all about number being reality. Well, one of the things we know about Pythagoreanism is that one of their sacred symbols was this thing called the tetrachus. You're seeing it on the screen here to the left. The idea of the tetrachus, right, is the idea that from one monad can give rise to two monads, right, plus, right, so these two plus one give rise to three, and these three plus one give rise to four. Add all of it together, right, you get a base 10 counting system. And from a base 10 counting system, you have basically the origins of the number system, and then from there you have the origins of arithmetic, etc., etc. It's a geometric way of describing how numericality itself comes into existence. Now, I know that sounds really abstract. That's because it's really abstract, right? But we know this from the Pythagorean world, right? They also call them, there were 10 of these, right? There are 10 of these tetrachus, right? The tetrachus is a 10-node system. Well, guess what we know about the Sephirot Belima? There are 10. And the text is really clear in Sefer Yetzirah. 10, not 9, 10, not 11. Exactly 10. I think, that what the Sephirot mean are the basic structure of a decimal counting system. That's what we have here in decimal counting system. Why? Right? Because the symbol of 10 represents completeness in the Pythagorean system. And 2, the Sephirot are also always described in relationship to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So for the Sefer Yetzirah, the world's created by 2 things. 3 things. God, right? Using the 10 Sphirot and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, combine them together, you create everything else. So you have, well, you imagine, right? What do you have? You have all the numbers, all the letters, combine all the numbers and letters together, and you get a universe. One can imagine the 10 Sephirot are the 10 countable things, the base 10 system of counting, plus the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, They are the palette by which God painted the world into existence. So, in Sefer Yetzirah, they are not emanations of God. They are numerical structures, which when combined with the alphabet, are the substructure of reality. Language and math. Right? I think that's what's going on in Sefer Yetzirah. Now, if you go ask someone else, they'll give you another story. They'll give you another story. Right? I think that's what's going on. And I think that I base that upon read other Neo-Pythagorean literature and make the exact same argument. Right? So I think that's what's going on here. Now, what we get in Sefer Yetzirah is a description of several successive stages the universe went through, right? So if you tell the story now, right, we have the Big Bang, the period of inflation, right? And then we have the world we have it now, and eventually we'll have the black hole period and proton decay or whatever. Right? There are successive stages of the universe. Sefer Yetzirah also describes successive stages of the universe, how we come to be. Now we can't get into the weeds of all that tonight. We just don't have enough time to do all of that. Spend an entire 8 weeks just on Sefer Yetzirah. But what's really important is that the mature part of the universe, right? The mature part of the Olam is governed by what the Sefer Yetzirah calls ketzivot. Ketzivot are limits, right? Limits, they're extremities. Again, that, by the way, limits, extremities, is Pythagorean language. They're translating this Pythagorean language, in my opinion, into Hebrew. And ketzivot are these kinds of limits. Now, what do those limits look like, right? Well, there are fundamentally 3 dimensions, right? 3 dimensions. Well, I say 3 dimensions, right? It's actually like 6 dimensions, but so they are, right? We have 2 dimensions of time, beginning and ending. We have 2 dimensions of space, right? Or 2 dimensions of, so 2 dimensions of time, 2 dimensions of space, above and below, and those include the 4 cardinal directions. So above and below, right, are the cardinal directions, and in those they split off into the other directions. And then along with the 2 dimensions of time, beginning and ending, and the 2 dimensions of space, there are also 2 moral dimensions, right, good and evil. This is a pretty interesting way of thinking about reality with this time period. And again, I think that someone with a background in physics, like Al, can appreciate, right? They're already imagining reality as having dimensionality. There are these mathematical ways of understanding the nature of reality that are describable abstractly as what we might call dimensions, what they call ketzivot, or limits, or extremities. This is followed by a very intense and very somewhat strange analysis of the Hebrew alphabet itself, in which the writer of this text groups Hebrew letters into 3 groups based on the articulation of the points of the mouth. So when you make a mem sound, using your lips, labials, right? When you make a dalet sound, dentals. When you make an aleph sound, right? A ayin sound, right? Those are gutturals, right? Those are articulated at different points. And so it's a kind of quasi-primitive, right? When I say primitive, I don't mean backwards, but I mean ancient form of linguistic analysis, right? So they're analyzing language in terms of where these things are articulated in the face, the mouth, and then finally what happens is the letters are all set into a correspondence. And the way that the writer of Sefer Yetzirah imagines the cosmos, right, or reality, is the reality has 3 layers. There's the Olam, right? The whole big Megillah, right? There's time. Time is the movement of the Olam, right? And there's the human being. And the human being is the center of it, right? Because they are something that exists, and they are moving through time. And so the human being, the nefesh, the soul, right, is the nexus of the cosmos and time, right? And so they understand this. So what you get in the Sefer Yetzirah is a very very involved system in which letters are assigned to members of the zodiac, right? Shana, time, right? And then also letters are combined to describe the cosmos, right? Various parts of the cosmos, and they also describe various parts of your body. So your liver, your heart, and your eyes are essentially corresponding with various letters of the alphabet. Because again, God spoke the world into being, and when God said ayin, right? Folks know this, right? The word ayin. Ayin is a Hebrew letter, and guess what ayin means? Eyes, right? God's not joshing around here, folks. When God said, I am. And what does sight see like? Right? So we get this system of correspondence. So the Sefer Yetzirah is a very rigorous, scientific, philosophical, metaphysical analysis of how reality is. There have been several different periods of time. I just want to talk a little bit about those periods of time, have worked themselves out, right? So we have a few different periods of time in the development of Sefer Yetzirah, right? The earliest period of time is when it developed. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know anything about that time. We don't know exactly when and how it was developed. We think it was probably in kind of a Gnostic, theurgical, magical Greek Syriac world, but it's anyone's guess. The first time we see the Sefer Yetzirah emerge is in philosophical scientific commentaries of the 10th century, right? The 10th through the 12th century, the leading Jewish minds at the time spent time writing commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah. And they did it to try to show how this accurately describes the fundamental structure of reality. Now, again, when the Sadia Gaon, to give an example, right? Sadia Gaon gives Burns commentary on this. If the Sadia Gaon, the leading authority in all the Jewish world at the time, feels the need to write commentary on this, well, by God, that's true, right? If he takes it seriously, you bet your ass you're going to take it seriously, right? And it's not just him. It's Nolo, it's all kinds of Barzilai, lots of people. So we have these scientific commentaries of the 10th to the 12th century. And then the book becomes magicalized. Because if it describes how God made the world, and if righteous people can make their own worlds, then this might be a roadmap to making our own stuff. And so it enters into its magical period, specifically in Europe with the Ashkenaz in the 11th and 13th century, right? And then eventually it's synthesized into the Kabbalah in the 13th century, and eventually it makes its way into Christianity. We'll get into a little bit more of this other more recent stuff in a bit. Now, of course, the Sefer Yetzirah is most heavily associated at the level of magic with the golem. I'm sure most folks here have heard of the golem. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the golem. But the golem, of course, is an artificial humanoid made from clay animated by magical images, specifically by techniques found in the Sefer Yetzirah. The earliest descriptions for the production of a golem are found primarily in the 12th century, and the commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah written by Eliezer Burns, a German Ashkenazi rabbi, and he writes how to create a golem using various kinds of magical techniques, meditation techniques primarily, combining letters with vowels over and over and over again in a form of mystical meditation, and one can transform clay into a human being through these mystical meditations. And so the golem becomes this sort of artificial human. By the way, the word golem actually doesn't appear in the Bible once, I think, to describe unformed fetus. It's actually sort of the word for fetus in the Bible. It's an entity that's not quite human and not quite not human, somewhere in between. That's why, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, if you kill someone, you're subject to the death penalty. But if in the middle of a fight, a man hits a woman who's pregnant and calls her to miscarry, but he's not subject to the death penalty because the thing inside her is a golem, not a person. Right? So the rabbis are actually very clear about what the person was not. For them, unborn people, right, unborn entity, golem is not people. That's why there's a death penalty, which is something I think is weird. I don't know why it's more fundamentalist Christians and people don't really. They're all about reading the Bible. Be about it. Don't talk about it. Be about it. Read this thing. At any rate, the golem, right, is how this idea came about, right? Because if God can make things and I can make things, I can use speech to make things too, and the golem has become the quintessential legend for this. Now, you can grab the golem of Prague, just as a myth-busting thing to ruin your night. The golem of Prague was invented by a 19th century German writer, non-Jewish German writer, described the whole idea to the Maharal in Prague. The Maharal of Prague never made a golem. There was no golem legends prior to the 19th century in Prague. Now, don't go shouting that very loudly if you go to Prague because they'll throw you out of a window. That's Prague hospitality. Because they make a lot of money on tourism on the whole golem thing. But Maharal of Prague never made a golem. never was interested in golems. If you read the Maharal's actual writings, he would have been very opposed to things like that. He was a pretty 10 and 2 by the book kind of legalist, actually. So that's Pyre Legend. In some ways, by whole cloth. Although the Golem movie is very important, what's also interesting about the Golem movie, I'll just mention here briefly, is that the Golem movie, as we have it, is actually a prequel. The original Golem movie and the sequel have both been lost. They're lost movies, sadly. So if you ever go see the Golem movie that you have is a prequel to a movie that's been lost, and the sequel, which we also know was made, has also been lost. Two of these movies that a lot of, as you may know, a lot of film back in the day was printed on things like nitrocellulose or whatever, like really, really combustible film, and even a spark could burn the whole thing down. So a lot of these movies were lost. So if you ever see the Golem, just know that you're watching a prequel to a movie that was very popular that's been lost now. So the invention of an artificial humanoid, and further, like the last thing I'll say about Sefer Yetzirah is that dozens of commentaries on this little book have been written in the century since it's been written. Sefer Yetzirah is probably the single most common book after the Bible and the I should be careful what I say about that. There are dozens of commentaries. I will say that on Sefer Yetzirah, and Standard Edition has at least 12 commentaries attached to it. And so the Sefer Yetzirah in the traditional Jewish world is a highly, highly, highly commented upon book, and it is in fact, to this day, I would say it is a canonical book of Jewish scripture. As we get into Europe, right? As we get into Europe, India, and the world of the Ashkenaz, we're going to run a little over tonight, but I think it's okay. I won't try to go too far over. As we get into Europe, we get into the world of the Ashkenaz. As we've been in the Middle East for a while, right? We've been in ancient Israel, ancient Palestine, we've been in ancient Egypt, we've been in ancient Mesopotamia. The focus begins to shift beginning in the period of the 10th and 11th centuries. That has a lot to do with what's going on in the Middle East with things like the Mongol invasions and some kind of crackdowns, at least at some level, in terms of things get a little stricter in the Islamic world. And so the intellectual simply begin to shift to traditional Jewish parts of the world in Europe. Ashkenaz being one of them. Now, people have these bizarre ideas that all of European Jews are descendants of Khazars that converted in the 9th century or something, and that all European Jews are not really Jews. There's all the kind of bizarre and experiences. Jews have been in Europe for thousands of years, right? Because Jews have been traveling with the Romans the entire time, and wherever the Romans established trade places, Jews went. Like lots of people went. Greeks went, right? People forget, like that. Massalia, Marseille, on the very south coast of France, was a Greek colony. Right, set there to do trade. So trade and movement of population has happened all through the Roman world. People forget that one of the capitals of the Roman Empire was Trier in Germany, right? That blows people's mind, but Constantine the Great was born in Trier, in what is now Germany. It's the birthplace of Karl Marx. So Jews have been in Europe for centuries. Now, what goes online, right, is that beginning in this period, right, Jews come to the forefront of learning other kinds of things, not just trade. And in Ashkenaz, around the turn of the millennium, maybe a couple hundred years after the turn of the millennium with 1000 Common Era, we have a very weird esoteric theology development. It's called the unique cherub circle. And the unique cherub circle introduced the idea that God in the world can't be directly connected. Why? Well, it's simple philosophy. If God is infinite and the world is finite, then the distance between the infinite and the finite is always going to be infinite. That's a theological problem. So what do? You need something that links the world. You need a bridge. Something that's quasi-finite and something that's quasi-infinite. And what they introduced was the idea of Ha'atzalah, right? Ha'atzalah. That God flows out of God's self, and somehow the flowing out of God's self bridges the gap between the infinite God and the finite world. And the thing that bridges the gap for this group of people was a thing called the unique cherub, right? The cherub is a kind of angel, as you probably know. And this unique cherub bore the glory of God. that God's glory had a hidden inner glory, right? It's like imagine the inside of the sun, right? The inside of the sun is full of like energy and intensity, but we never see it. What do we see of the sun? We see the outside layer, right? We see the outer glory. And the outer glory, right, of God, these outer kavod, flows out and becomes a kind of special angel, a unique cherub. And that special angel is an atzalah, is an emanation of flowing out of God, right? And that bridges the gap between the infinite and the finite with the unique cherub in the middle. Now, we don't know much about this group, right? This is a very strange group of rabbis there in Ashkenaz, in Germany, and we're still doing research about this. But it seems like they've been introduced to the idea of Neoplatonism. And we'll talk about Neoplatonism next time. We'll talk about it. Now, what ends up happening is that infused with this idea of Hatzalah, of emanation, the separate Yetzirah gets fused to it. So the idea is, well, it can't just be one thing, right? Maybe it's 10. Maybe there are 10 things standing between the infinite, utter transcendent God and us. And maybe between those things, there are 10 things. Because Sefer Yetzirah said there are 10. 10 Sephirot Belimah, right? So maybe the ladder has 10 rungs. Maybe the ladder has 10 rungs. And that idea of the ladder having 10 rungs is taken up in the first Kabbalistic text in history, the Sefer Bahir. This is, folks, the first text of Kabbalah. If you want to start studying Kabbalah, this is the text you start with, the Sefer Bahir. This is the first corrected version you see here on the left-hand side. This is a midrash, right? Midrashim are texts in which the Bible is used as a stepping stone, or diving board, better, right? To riff, right? Like, folks feel like jazz, right? You like jazz, right? One of the things that, go to a jazz show, right? Coltrane might start a riff, right? And then Monk might pick up, right? The drums. And then someone else is going to pick up, right? And then they're going to riff. They're going to riff, and they're going to riff, and they're going to riff. Variation on themes, right? If you want to think about what Midrash is Jewish jazz. It's taking a riff and going with it, right? Commenting on it, legends, weird stuff, strange ideas, right? Don't read this, read that. Turn the letters around backwards, read it that way, right? It's riffing, right? It's improvisation on these ideas. Midrash is Jewish jazz, right? So, what we get in the Sefer Bahir is a work of Jewish jazz, Midrash, very popular in the Middle Ages, right? But this Jewish Midrash is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is because it's ascribed to a first century Jewish scholar, Nehunya ben Hakana. Now, Nehunya ben Hakana didn't write this, but it's ascribed to him to kind of give it a little gravitas. Further, what's also really important about this is it's very clear whoever wrote this is doing some really, really interesting theological, philosophical mysticism. They're riffing on this material, on the Bible, in a way we've never seen before. Now, did they make it all up? Were they part of a larger tradition? Was there a community of people doing this? This is just the one work that survived? We don't know. Right? What we do know is this text introduces the core concepts that become the foundation for the Kabbalah as we know it. Now, these midrashim inside of there are 200 of these inside of the Sefer Bahir, they are not united in the stretch of the imagination. In fact, the story goes right that the writer must have written them all down, and then the story is they threw them in the air, and ever how they landed, that's how they got edited together. The editing seems random, right? Now, there are passages that do seem contiguous, and then they kind of teeter off into seemingly random commentaries. But there are a couple things that are very crucially important about Sefer Bahir. The first thing that's really crucially important is Sefer Bahir combined Sefer Yetzirah and the unique cherub circle. The Sefer Bahir says there are emanations of God, right? There's again, like folks ever like bowl of milk, right? Or like this is better yet. You just like go to a wedding where someone's pouring champagne over like one glass, and one glass is on like two glasses, and two glasses on four glasses, right? They're pouring the champagne flows down all the glasses. Well, imagine like pouring a champagne, the bottle never got empty, right? That's what the separate are. It's God pouring God's self out, but because God is infinite, God never becomes empty, and the world becomes full. Right? That's what the invitations are. So Sefer Bahir does two really important things in this respect. It combines the 10 Sepharot of the Sefer Yetzirah with the idea of emanation. It says, yes, God emanated in 10 forms, distinct forms. There are 10 distinct emanations, and it discusses them. Now, Kabbalah, as you probably know it, everyone knows it. If there's nothing else that makes Kabbalah Kabbalah, it's that. There are 10 emanations. They relate to each other. There are various aspects of God. God's mercy, God's judgment, God's glory, God's victory, God's beauty. Right? That's a core component of Kabbalah. We'll start getting into that stuff next time. Right? So that's one thing, very important thing that Sefer Bahir does. It combines those two ideas in one system for the first time. Secondly, right, what Sefer Bahir does is it introduces the idea that God has a feminine form, the Shekhinah, right? Now, the idea of the Shekhinah goes all the way back to the Talmud, right? Never does God have a feminine form. It's just that the word Shekhinah is feminine grammar-wise. But in the Bahir, the Shekhinah is described as a lady. Almost always in the same kind of language being used to describe other women in the medieval period. Which got described as a matronita. Right? It's a Latin term that becomes an important term in medieval court lore. So God's presence in the world becomes feminized. Again, if you know nothing else about Kabbalah, you know that the Shekhinah is the feminine presence of God in the world. Every time you've ever been to a Kabbalah Shabbat service, sung Lech HaNogi, it's all about welcoming the Shabbat bride, the Shabbat bride, with God's feminine form. This idea appears for the first time in Sefer Bahir. Right? And again, the language here is full of courtly language. We think this text is written time in the early Middle Ages. Although there are people like Bernie who actually says that the name Pharaohs here says the name of Babylon. It's really hard to tell. Frankly, those folks are such brilliant scholars that I'm just going to defer to their intuition. What's also important about the descriptions of Shekhinah in the Sefer Bahir is that she's almost always described these really weird terms as an exile, that she came from the land of light, or that she's a princess from a faraway land. And scholars, at least of an early generation, I think even some scholars now, and even me, detect that in Gnostic literature, we'll talk maybe a little bit more about Gnostic literature in the Q&A afterwards. There's an idea in Gnostic literature, this is a form of heterodox religion that existed back in the ancient classical world, where there's the incarnation of Sophia, of wisdom, and she makes a mistake. And she creates this hideous ruler god who creates our physical world and our physical world from traps, right? But she's the incarnation of light, brilliance, and wisdom, right? And she's always described as being from another world, right? And some people think, right, especially in earlier generation scholarship, maybe even some folks now, think that the Sefer Bahir may continue forth a tradition or drag into the Middle Ages some Gnostic ideas. We can talk more about those later if folks are interested in those Gnostic ideas. But there seems to be some kind of quasi-Gnostic character to the Shekhinah as she appears in the Sefer Bahir. The last couple things I'll say about the Sefer Bahir as we wrap up tonight is, one, the Sefer Bahir describes divine power as a kind of tree, right? It's kind of fullness. Now that tree language is going to be obviously very important, because if you've ever studied Kabbalah, the one thing you'll know is that the Sephirot are all arrayed in what's called an Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and that tree language, right? God is a kind of divine tree, also appears in Sefer Bahir. And it describes God as having roots and limbs, blood, flowers, leaves, and things. There's sort of a fullness to God, which also seems to maybe have its origins in very ancient Gnostic schools of thought. Also, and this will be important as we get later on into Kabbalah proper, is that for the Sefer Bahir, evil seems to have a life of its own. Now, in traditional Judaism and in traditional Christianity, evil is thought of as a privation, right? Augustine, I'll just give an example from the Christian tradition, right? Augustine says that evil isn't a thing in itself, right? Evil is a lack of something. It's a lack of God's grace. In the same way that heat is a thing, coldness is. Darkness is not a thing, light is. Darkness is just the term we use for the absence of light. Cold is the term we use for the absence of heat. Evil is just the term we use for the absence of God. Well, ancient Gnostics believed that evil was very real. It has its own existence. And there are sections in the Sefer Bahir that say, yeah, evil existed on its own. It was out there all along. God kind of tamed it, but not quite. And what we'll see when we get into Proto-Kabbalah next time is that evil is going to be one of the overwhelmingly interesting things in the part of the Kabbalah. Where did evil come from? Because, as you might imagine, Jews living in Europe in the 13th century are going to deal with a lot of evil. And they're going to be very interested in where evil comes from. And the image that the traditional Kabbalists will use is the very image you're seeing here on the left. But evil is the sparks thrown off the anvil as God created the world. Right? Just as when you create a knife, you have to pound the steel. As you pound the steel, it throws off dross. Well, when God made the world, he threw off dross. And that dross, for the early Kabbalists, is evil. And it's always been here. It's always been here. And that image of the blacksmith hammering at the anvil will be an image we'll see repeatedly when we get into Kabbalah. Well, folks, we are there. We have now crossed the threshold from the Merkava Techalot world. We are now into the world of what I call the Proto-Kabbalah. Now, what I want to just reinforce as we wrap up for the night is that Kabbalah was not born all at once. As you can see, these ideas are developing. We have the Sephiros from the Sefer Yetzirah. We have the emanation sequence from the unique cherub circle. We have it synthesized by the Sefer Bahir. We're going to see that later texts further synthesize ideas from the Sefer Bahir. Kabbalah is a development. It's a development. So it's really important to understand that when people talk about the Kabbalah, right, what we should talk about is Kabbalistic development and then the schools of Kabbalah. Right? And as we'll see, we'll get into this later on as we get into Kabbalah, we'll see this a lot more clearly. Well, finally, I just want to point to some additional reading. I know that folks love to do, folks like to get into this stuff, and I know that literature on the Kabbalah can be a little admired, right? You have to be really, really technically sophisticated, and you have to learn to read 15 languages to figure this stuff out, or you see like a lot of hooey stuff that people just make up out of their mind. But these texts are all really solid. I mentioned earlier, right, that Zahi Weiss, I think, has written, I think for me, it's one of the best arguments for the early history and development of the Kabbalah. So if you really want to get into the weeds of how Kabbalah, about Sefer Yetzirah, rather, how Sefer Yetzirah developed, I think Zahi Weiss has a really great argument, in my opinion. The Peter Haman text is a standard edition now, critical edition of the Kabbalah. You get an ILL, that one, it costs like $800. So you can get it from the university library, but it is a standard analysis of the Sefer Yetzirah. R.A. Kaplan is a standard one we get our heads on. It's okay. He analyzes the Sefer Yetzirah from a Lurianic Kabbalistic perspective, which isn't bad or anything, but I think it distorts the text in a way that I find to be confusing, especially people who've never encountered the text before. In the standard religious version of the Sefer Yetzirah, the best religious version, if you want to read a religious version with a bunch of commentaries, is the Sefer Yetzirah Hashalem, that's published by Harav Moshe Serial. You can get that. I gave folks a link if you want to find out, but you'll need to learn, you'll need to be able to review and stuff for that one. That's only new. So if you want to copy that one, I can send you a link to it if you'd like. And for Sefer Bahir, Joseph Don has a book on both early Kabbalah and the unique cherub circle. That unique cherub circle book also is an ILL. It's very expensive. We'll get to the books of contemplation next week. And also, Ari Kaplan has a nice version of the series over here. That again comes with the same caveat, right? These are Lurianic Kabbalists. They bring a specific Lurianic interpretation to the text that, again, it can be confusing. I'm not opposed to Kabbalists doing Kabbalah. I mean, Kabbalists who do Kabbalah, that's their bag. But I think that ultimately, beginner people pick it up. It's like, oh, this is what it means. And I'm like, yeah, no, it's not quite that. It's more complicated than that. So again, I don't want to fault the Kabbalists for being Kabbalists, but it's not academic, right? It's not an academic text. But it is easily accessible and widely available online. Well, folks, next week we turn to the early Kabbalah. We're going to be looking at some developments in southern France and Spain. We're going to be looking at how the earliest strata of Kabbalah developed. Then after that, we turn to the most monumental text in all of Jewish mystical history. That's the Sefer so far, right? The Book of Illumination. My child is named Zohar. If you want to get an idea about how important this book is to me and mine, I got a kid named Zohar. So I take it very seriously, and so we'll get to the Sefer Zohar after the time after next. Next time we'll be dealing with development, philosophical, mystical developments in the earliest stages of Kabbalah in Europe, in the very early stages of Kabbalah at all. So we'll turn to the early Kabbalah next time. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden.